A deranged man struck a royal guard over the head with a beer bottle, smiling with cruel satisfaction as blood trickled down the soldier's face. He believed he'd made his mark, that he'd broken the guard. But what happened next brought the entire crowd to a standstill. Before we show you how it all played out, be sure to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't miss tomorrow's story, another powerful example of the royal guard's unshakable courage and discipline. The sun was setting behind Buckingham Palace, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink as tourists gathered for their last glimpse of the famous guards. Standing perfectly still in his ceremonial position was Guardsman Daniel Carter, a man whose very presence seemed to embody discipline itself. At 28, he had spent the last 6 years perfecting the art of absolute stillness, his scarlet uniform impeccable, his bearskin hat positioned with military precision. Carter had mastered the ability to become invisible while remaining completely visible. Tourists would approach him constantly, trying every trick in the book to get a reaction, waving hands in front of his face, making silly poses, even attempting to engage him in conversation. But Carter had learned something during his 3 deployments to Afghanistan that served him well in this role. True strength wasn't about responding to every provocation, but about choosing when and how to act. The evening crowd was typical for this time of day: families finishing their London adventure, couples taking romantic photos, and the usual collection of street performers preparing to pack up their equipment. The atmosphere was relaxed, almost festive, as people savored the final moments of their palace visit. But threading through this peaceful scene was something different. Michael Dorson, 42 years old and recently unemployed, was making his way through the crowd with the unsteady gait of someone who had been drinking since the afternoon. His football jersey was stained with beer and sweat, his jeans torn at the knee, and his eyes held that dangerous glassy quality that comes from drowning sorrows rather than celebrating victories. Dorson's life had been unraveling for months. The construction company where he'd worked for 15 years had folded, his wife had left him, and his savings were nearly gone. Today was supposed to be different. His team had won their match, and he'd gone out to celebrate. But somewhere between the second and third pint, celebration had turned into something darker, more desperate. The bottle in Dorson's hand was half empty, the brown glass warm from his grip. He'd been carrying it for the past hour, using it as a prop while he asked strangers for money, his requests becoming more aggressive with each rejection. Now, as he spotted Carter standing motionless in his perfect uniform, something inside him snapped. Drunk man attacks royal guard with bottle. The guard's response changes everything. 0 o'clock to 3 o'clock. The sun was setting behind Buckingham Palace, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink as tourists gathered for their last glimpse of the famous guards. Standing perfectly still in his ceremonial position was Guardsman Daniel Carter, a man whose very presence seemed to embody discipline itself. At 28, he had spent the last 6 years perfecting the art of absolute stillness, his scarlet uniform impeccable, his bearskin hat positioned with military precision. Carter had mastered the ability to become invisible while remaining completely visible. Tourists would approach him constantly, trying every trick in the book to get a reaction, waving hands in front of his face, making silly poses, even attempting to engage him in conversation. But Carter had learned something during his 3 deployments to Afghanistan that served him well in this role. True strength wasn't about responding to every provocation, but about choosing when and how to act. The evening crowd was typical for this time of day: families finishing their London adventure, couples taking romantic photos, and the usual collection of street performers preparing to pack up their equipment. The atmosphere was relaxed, almost festive, as people savored the final moments of their palace visit. But threading through this peaceful scene was something different. Michael Dorson, 42 years old and recently unemployed, was making his way through the crowd with the unsteady gait of someone who had been drinking since the afternoon. His football jersey was stained with beer and sweat, his jeans torn at the knee, and his eyes held that dangerous glassy quality that comes from drowning sorrows rather than celebrating victories. Dorson's life had been unraveling for months. The construction company where he'd worked for 15 years had folded, his wife had left him, and his savings were nearly gone. Today was supposed to be different. His team had won their match, and he'd gone out to celebrate. But somewhere between the second and third pint, celebration had turned into something darker, more desperate. The bottle in Dorson's hand was half empty, the brown glass warm from his grip. He'd been carrying it for the past hour, using it as a prop while he asked strangers for money, his requests becoming more aggressive with each rejection. Now, As he spotted Carter standing motionless in his perfect uniform, something inside him snapped. 3 o'clock to 6 o'clock. Carter's peripheral vision caught Dorson's approach long before the man spoke. Height approximately 5'8", weight around 170, gait unsteady, but not completely unstable. The assessment was automatic, ingrained through years of military training that had taught him to evaluate every person as a potential threat while hoping they would prove to be something else entirely. "Look at this one," Dorson muttered, loud enough for nearby tourists to hear. Standing there like he owns the whole bloody palace, the crowd's energy shifted perceptibly. Conversations quieted, phones were lowered, and parents instinctively moved their children closer. Carter's breathing remained perfectly controlled for counts in. Pause. For counts out a rhythm he'd learned during his first tour when the stress of constant vigilance had nearly broken him. Dorson's appearance told a story of recent decline. His once white jersey was stained with the evidence of his day's drinking, and his eyes held that particular desperation that comes from having nothing left to lose. The bottle in his hand wasn't just a drink anymore. It had become a symbol of everything he felt had been taken from him. "Oi, toy soldier," Dorson called out, his voice carrying the false courage that alcohol provides. "I'm talking to you." The tourists around Carter began to form an unconscious circle, their curiosity warring with their instinct for safety. A young mother with a push hair stopped pretending to organize her belongings and started watching the scene unfold. An elderly gentleman paused his conversation with his wife, his experienced eyes recognizing the signs of trouble brewing. Carter's training kicked in automatically. He cataloged every detail of his surroundings: the position of civilians, the location of exits, the approximate distance to the nearest security station. But beneath the tactical assessment, something else was happening. Carter was beginning to see not just a potential threat, but a human being in distress. The bottle in Dorson's hand caught the fading sunlight, the amber liquid inside sloshing gently with each movement. There was a small crack running down one side, evidence of an earlier drop, that made the glass look fragile despite its thickness. Carter found himself watching that crack, wondering how much pressure it would take to shatter the whole thing. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" Dorson continued, his voice rising. "Standing there in your fancy dress-up costume, while real people are struggling to survive." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Carter understood the frustration behind it, even if he couldn't respond. During his time in Afghanistan, he'd encountered similar anger from locals who saw his uniform as a symbol of occupation, rather than protection. The difference was context there. Such confrontations could turn deadly in seconds. Here, surrounded by tourists and palace security, the danger was more subtle but no less real. Dorson was getting closer now, close enough that Carter could smell the beer on his breath and see the deep lines of exhaustion etched around his eyes. The man wasn't just drunk, he was tired, bone-deep tired in a way that suggested he'd been fighting battles long before he'd approached Carter's position. The crowd was growing larger, drawn by the magnetic pull of potential conflict. Someone in the back was recording on their phone, though they were trying to be discreet about it. Carter could sense the collective holding of breath. The way people leaned forward slightly when they sensed drama was about to unfold. "My father fought in real wars," Dorson said, his voice cracking with emotion. "He came back with shrapnel in his leg and nightmares that never went away. But he was a real soldier, not some tourist attraction in a monkey suit." The words hit Carter differently than he'd expected. There was pain in them, real pain, and a grief that went deeper than unemployment or divorce. Dorson was carrying something heavier than his personal struggles. He was carrying the weight of family history, of expectations he could never meet, of a legacy he didn't know how to honor. Carter's own father had been a career soldier, a man who'd served in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, and had come home changed by the experience. Carter understood the burden of military families, the way service could become both a source of pride and a kind of prison that trapped generations in cycles of duty and sacrifice. The bottle was shaking in Dorson's hand now, not from anger but from the simple physical strain of holding up emotional weight that had grown too heavy to bear. The crack in the glass had widened slightly, creating a thin line that caught the light like a scar. Palace security was moving into position now, their approach professional but cautious. Carter could see Sergeant Mills among them, his expression tense but controlled. Mills had served with Carter in Afghanistan and understood the delicate balance required in situations like this. Too much pressure could cause an explosion. Too little could allow things to spiral out of control. The silence between Carter and Dorson stretched like a taut wire, vibrating with tension and possibility. Carter had been in similar situations before, moments where the wrong word or gesture could turn a conversation into a catastrophe. But he'd also learned that sometimes the most powerful response was no response at all, that silence could be its own form of communication. Dorson was staring at him now, really looking, as if trying to see past the uniform to the person underneath. "You're not even going to acknowledge me, are you?" he said, his voice filled with something that might have been wonder. "I'm standing here pouring my heart out to you, and you're just going to pretend I don't exist." The accusation was both true and false. Carter was absolutely aware of Dorson's presence, of his pain, of the desperate need for connection that had driven him to this moment. But acknowledging that awareness would mean breaking protocol, abandoning the discipline that had kept him alive in Afghanistan and successful in his current role. The crowd had grown to about 30 people now, a mix of tourists and locals who'd been drawn by the unfolding drama. But the energy was different from what Carter had expected. Instead of the bloodthirsty excitement that often accompanied public confrontations, there was something more thoughtful, more compassionate. People seemed to recognize that they were witnessing something deeper than a simple disturbance. A young woman in a university sweatshirt had tears in her eyes, moved by the raw emotion in Dorson's voice. An older man in a business suit was speaking quietly to his companion, his tone suggesting sympathy rather than judgment. Even the tourists seemed to understand that this was about more than just getting a good video for social media. Dorson was looking at the bottle now, turning it slowly in his hands as if it contained answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. The amber liquid inside caught the palace lights, creating tiny reflections that danced across his weathered face. "I used to have a plan," he said, his voice barely audible. "Good job, loving wife, maybe kids someday. It all made sense when I was younger. Now I'm standing here talking to someone who can't talk back because I've got nobody else left to talk to." The honesty was brutal and beautiful at the same time. Carter felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that went deeper than training or duty. This wasn't about palace security or public order anymore. This was about one human being reaching out to another across the void of their separate experiences. The weight of Dorson's words settled over the scene like a blanket. Carter could feel the crowd's energy shifting, the way their attention had moved from anticipation to something more complex. They were witnessing not just a confrontation, but a confession, a man stripping away pretense and pride to reveal the raw wound of his existence. Dorson's grip on the bottle had loosened, and Carter could see that the crack in the glass had spread, creating a delicate web of fractures that made the container look like it was held together by nothing more than hope and surface tension. It was a perfect metaphor for the man holding it, damaged but not yet broken, fragile but still intact. "I served too," Dorson said suddenly, his voice stronger now. "Nothing like what you probably did, but I wore the uniform. Territorial Army. 2 years when I was young and stupid enough to think I could make a difference." The revelation changed everything. Carter felt the familiar recognition that passed between veterans, regardless of their service record or the time that had elapsed since they'd hung up their boots. Dorson wasn't just a drunk civilian causing trouble. He was a brother in arms who'd lost his way, someone who'd once understood the weight of duty and the burden of service. The knowledge explained so much about Dorson's behavior, his anger, his desperate need to be seen and acknowledged. Military service created a particular kind of person, someone who'd learned to function as part of something larger than themselves, who'd found meaning in structure and purpose in sacrifice. When that framework was removed, the adjustment could be devastating. Carter's own transition from active duty to palace guard had been relatively smooth, but he'd had advantages that Dorson clearly lacked. He'd had support from his unit, ongoing structure in his new role, and the kind of mental health resources that hadn't been available to previous generations of veterans. Palace security was getting closer now, their patience wearing thin. Carter could see the tension in their posture, the way they were preparing to intervene if the situation escalated. But he could also see something else, the way Dorson's shoulders had begun to relax, the way the fight was slowly going out of him. 2nd Battalion, London Regiment, Dorson continued, his voice carrying a pride that the years hadn't managed to erode completely. "We weren't special forces or anything glamorous, but we were soldiers, we mattered." The pride in Dorson's voice was unmistakable, cutting through the alcohol and despair like a blade. Carter understood that feeling completely, the way military service could become part of your identity, the way it could give meaning to existence, even when everything else felt pointless. But he also understood how devastating it could be when that identity was stripped away. by circumstances beyond your control. The bottle was trembling in Dorson's hands now, the network of cracks spreading across the glass like a spider's web. Carter found himself watching it with fascination, wondering if it would shatter from the pressure of Dorson's grip or simply dissolve into fragments. When the accumulated stress became too much to bear, "I was proud of my service," Dorson said, his voice getting quieter, "not because we did anything heroic, but because we were part of something important. We had a purpose, a mission, brothers who had our backs. Now I look at myself and I can't figure out how I got from there to here." The question hung in the air like a challenge to the universe itself. Carter knew the answer, even if he couldn't voice it. The transition from military to civilian life was a minefield that claimed casualties. Long after the shooting stopped, some veterans adapted, found new purposes, built new identities. Others, like Dorson, found themselves adrift in a world that didn't seem to have a place for the skills they'd learned or the values they'd internalized. The crowd had thinned somewhat, but those who remained seemed genuinely invested in the outcome. There was something about Dorson's raw honesty that had touched them, made them see past the drunk and disorderly exterior to the struggling human being underneath. A young boy was tugging at his mother's sleeve, asking questions in a whisper that carried clearly in the evening air. "Why is the man sad? Mummy, why won't the soldier help him?" The innocent question hit Carter like a physical blow. Children saw things so clearly, without the layers of complexity that adults used to shield themselves from uncomfortable truths. The boy was right, Dorson was sad, and Carter's inability to respond wasn't helping the situation. But breaking protocol wasn't just about personal choice. It was about duty, responsibility, the weight of the uniform he wore. Dorson had heard the child's question too, and something in his expression softened. "He can't help me, little one," he said, his voice gentle despite its underlying pain. "He's got his own job to do, his own burdens to carry. Some of us just have to figure things out on our own." The gentleness in Dorson's response to the child revealed something important about his character. Despite his pain, despite the alcohol and the desperation, there was still kindness in him, still a fundamental decency that hadn't been eroded by his circumstances. Carter felt a surge of something he couldn't quite name: respect, maybe, or recognition of a kindred spirit. The bottle was barely holding together now, the cracks having spread across almost the entire surface. It looked like a piece of stained glass, beautiful and fragile and ready to shatter at the slightest touch. Carter found himself hoping that when it finally broke, it would do so quietly, without adding more violence to an already fragile moment. "I keep thinking about my father," Dorson continued, his voice growing stronger. "He never talked about what he saw in the Falklands, but I could see it in his eyes sometimes. The weight of it, the memories he couldn't shake. I thought I was different, thought I was stronger. Turns out I was just luckier until I wasn't." The generational weight of military service was something Carter had encountered before in his own family. His grandfather had served in Korea, his father in Northern Ireland, and now him in Afghanistan. Each generation had carried their own invisible wounds, their own burdens that couldn't be shared with civilians who hadn't experienced the particular intensity of combat. Palace security was moving closer now, their approach careful but determined. Carter could see the concern in their faces, the way they were balancing the need to maintain order with the recognition that this situation required delicate handling. Sergeant Mills caught his eye and nodded slightly, a gesture that said he understood the complexity of the moment. The crowd had grown quiet, sensing that something significant was happening. The energy had shifted from anticipation to something more reverent, as if they were witnessing a sacred ritual rather than a public disturbance. Even the tourists seemed to understand that this was about more than just entertainment. Dorson was looking directly at Carter now, his eyes clear despite the alcohol. "You know what the hardest part is," he said, his voice filled with a kind of desperate honesty. "It's not the unemployment or the divorce or even the drinking. It's the feeling that everything I was trained to be, everything I learned to value, doesn't matter anymore. How do you rebuild yourself when you don't know what you're rebuilding toward?" The question was profound in its simplicity, touching on something that went to the heart of veteran experience. Carter felt the weight of it settling in his chest, the recognition that this was the real crisis, not Dorson's immediate circumstances, but his fundamental loss of purpose and identity. The question hung between them like a bridge that neither man knew how to cross. Carter felt the weight of his own experience, the way his transition from active duty to palace guard had been smoothed by structure and continued service. But he also felt something else, a deep empathy for someone who'd lost their way, who was struggling to find meaning in a world that seemed to have no place for the values they'd learned to cherish. Dorson was struggling with something, his face contorted with internal conflict. The bottle in his hand had become more than just a drink. It was a symbol of everything he'd lost, everything he'd failed to become. The cracks in the glass seemed to mirror the fractures in his own sense of self, beautiful and tragic and ready to shatter. "I used to think I was a good man," Dorson said, his voice breaking. "I helped my neighbors, paid my taxes, treated people with respect. I thought that mattered. I thought if you did the right things, life would work out. But here I am, threatening someone who's just trying to do his job, and I can't even figure out how I got to this point." The self-awareness was heartbreaking in its clarity. Carter could see that Dorson wasn't just drunk and angry, he was mourning, grieving for the person he used to be and the life he'd thought he was building. It was a kind of loss that went deeper than unemployment or divorce. It was the loss of faith in the basic fairness of existence. Palace security had formed a loose perimeter around them now, close enough to intervene but far enough away to avoid escalating the situation. Carter could see the calculation in their positioning, the way they were preparing for multiple scenarios while hoping for the best possible outcome. The crowd had grown smaller but more focused. Those who remained seemed genuinely moved by what they were witnessing, recognizing that this was about more than just a public disturbance. A young woman was crying openly, touched by the raw emotion on display. An older man was speaking quietly to his companion, his words carrying the tone of someone who'd recognized a universal truth about human suffering. Dorson was looking at the bottle now, really looking, as if seeing it for the first time. The network of cracks had spread across almost the entire surface, creating a delicate pattern that caught the light like a kaleidoscope. Very slowly, as if the movement required enormous effort, he began to examine his own reflection in the fractured glass. "I don't know who I am anymore," he said, his voice barely audible. "I look in the mirror and I see a stranger. I hear myself talking and I don't recognize the voice. How do you come back from that? How do you rebuild when you don't even know what the foundation is supposed to look like?" The philosophical depth of Dorson's question revealed something important about his character. This wasn't just a drunk man causing trouble. This was someone grappling with fundamental questions of identity and purpose. Someone who'd been broken by circumstances but was still trying to understand what had happened to him. Carter felt something shift inside him, a recognition that went deeper than military brotherhood or professional duty. This was about the universal human experience of loss and recovery, about the way life could strip away everything you thought you knew about yourself and leave you standing in the wreckage, wondering how to rebuild. The bottle was barely holding together now, the cracks having created a complex pattern that made the glass look like a work of art. Carter found himself fascinated by the metaphor, how something so damaged could still be beautiful, how fragility could coexist with strength. It was a perfect representation of the human condition, of the way people could be broken and whole at the same time. "I think I need help," Dorson said suddenly, his voice stronger than it had been all evening. "I've been telling myself I could handle this on my own, that asking for help was weakness. But look at me, I'm standing here threatening a palace guard because I can't figure out how to deal with my own life." The admission was brave and vulnerable, requiring the kind of courage that had nothing to do with physical bravery. Carter understood the difficulty of that moment. The way military training could make it almost impossible to admit weakness or ask for assistance. But he also understood that recognition of need was often the first step toward healing. Palace security was moving closer now, their approach gentle but purposeful. Carter could see Sergeant Mills among them, his expression a mixture of concern and professional competence. Mills understood the delicate balance required in moments like this, the way that heavy-handed intervention could destroy the progress that had been made. The crowd had grown very quiet, sensing that the climax was approaching. Those who remained seemed invested in the outcome, hoping for resolution rather than spectacle. The energy had shifted from anticipation to something more like prayer, as if everyone present was willing a positive outcome into existence. Dorson was looking directly at Carter now, his eyes clear and focused despite the alcohol. "I want you to know something," he said, his voice carrying a dignity that hadn't been there before. "I'm not proud of this. I'm not proud of any of it, but I'm grateful that you listened. Even if you couldn't respond, sometimes just being heard is enough." The gratitude was unexpected and profound, transforming the entire dynamic of the encounter. Carter felt something loosen in his chest, A recognition that sometimes the most important victories were the quiet ones, the moments when understanding replaced conflict. The transformation in Dorson's demeanor was remarkable. The anger and desperation that had driven him to this moment were being replaced by something else. Not happiness, exactly, but a kind of peace that came from being truly seen and acknowledged. Carter understood that this was what the man had been seeking all along. Not confrontation, but connection. The bottle in Dorson's hand was trembling now, not from emotion but from the simple physics of fractured glass trying to hold together. Under pressure, the cracks had spread across the entire surface, creating a complex web that made the container look like it was made of light rather than glass. Carter found himself holding his breath, waiting for the inevitable moment when the accumulated stress would become too much to bear. "I'm going to put this down now," Dorson said, his voice calm and clear. "Not because I'm afraid of you or your colleagues, but because I'm tired of carrying it. I'm tired of carrying all of it." The decision was visible in his posture, in the way his shoulders relaxed and his breathing deepened. Carter could see that the fight had gone out of him, replaced by something that looked like acceptance, not defeat, but the kind of surrender that came from recognizing that some battles couldn't be won alone. Palace security was very close now, their approach professional but compassionate. Carter could see that they understood the delicate nature of the moment, the way that rough handling could destroy the progress that had been made. Sergeant Mills was leading them, his expression showing the kind of wisdom that came from years of dealing with similar situations. The crowd had grown very small but incredibly focused. Those who remained seemed to understand that they were witnessing something significant, something that went beyond the usual tourist attractions of palace life. A young woman was still crying, but her tears seemed to be as much about hope as they were about sadness. An older man was nodding slowly, as if recognizing a truth he'd long suspected, but never articulated. Dorson was looking at the bottle one final time, studying his reflection in the fractured glass. "You know what I see," he said, his voice filled with something that might have been wonder. "I see someone who's broken but not destroyed, someone who's lost but might still find his way home." The insight was profound and beautiful, revealing a depth of self-awareness that had been hidden beneath the anger and desperation. Carter felt something shift in his own chest, a recognition that this encounter had changed him as much as it had changed Dorson. Very slowly, with infinite care, Dorson began to lower the bottle toward the ground. The movement was deliberate and controlled, like a ritual or a prayer made manifest. Carter watched the descent, understanding that this was more than just the end of a confrontation. It was the beginning of something new. The bottle touched the pavement with the softest of sounds, and for a moment, it seemed like the cracks might hold. But then, as if releasing a breath it had been holding for too long, the glass simply dissolved, separating into thousands of tiny fragments that caught the palace lights like stars scattered across the ground. The sound was almost musical, a gentle tinkling that seemed to carry away all the tension and fear that had built up over the past half hour. Dorson stood there in the scattered glass, no longer a threat, but simply a man who had found his way back from the edge of something dark and final. Carter remained at his post, still and strong and exactly where he was supposed to be. But something had changed in the quality of his stillness, in the way he held himself. He was no longer just a guard maintaining his position. He was a witness to human resilience, a silent participant in the kind of small miracle that happened when people chose understanding over judgment. The crowd began to disperse as palace security moved in, their approach gentle but professional. Sergeant Mills caught Carter's eye and nodded once, a gesture of understanding and respect that acknowledged the complexity of what had just occurred. As the evening settled around them, golden and warm and full of possibility, Carter understood that sometimes the most important battles were the ones fought not with weapons, but with patience, compassion, and the simple recognition that everyone deserved to be seen as human.